The courtroom was silent. No whispers, no movement, just tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then Judge Edith Jones leaned forward and said something that no one, not even Jasmine Crockett, saw coming.
The courtroom had gone completely silent. Not the kind of silence that feels calm, but the heavy kind, the kind that presses down on your chest. You could almost hear the tension in the air, like static before a thunderstorm. Every camera, every reporter, every spectator froze. All eyes were fixed on Jasmine Crockett, the bold young congresswoman from Texas who had made a name for herself by saying exactly what others were too afraid to say. She stood there, calm yet radiating energy, her hands clasped in front of her, chin slightly lifted. It wasn't arrogance, it was composure. It was power wrapped in grace. Moments earlier, she had been in the middle of explaining her stance on judicial ethics, how accountability shouldn't depend on status, and how truth should never bow to tradition. Her tone had been firm, confident, and yes, passionate. But that passion, apparently, didn't sit well with everyone. From the bench, Judge Edith Jones, a woman in her 70s, known for her decades of courtroom authority and her no-nonsense style, suddenly shifted her posture. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing just slightly, the kind of look that had made countless lawyers stumble over their words. And then, in a calm but cutting voice that carried across the entire chamber, she said, "Miss Crockett, your attitude in this hearing is precisely what's wrong with today's leaders." The words hit like a hammer. For a split second, you could almost feel the shock ripple through the courtroom. Pens stopped moving. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade into the background. It wasn't just what the judge said, it was how she said it. Cold, controlled, final. Everyone knew that Judge Jones wasn't someone you challenged lightly. She'd spent more than 30 years on the bench, feared and respected in equal measure. Her reputation was carved in stone, brilliant legal mind, but with zero tolerance for what she called modern political dramatics. And Jasmine Crockett? She was the embodiment of everything the judge represented as modern, young, fearless, outspoken, unapologetically confident. People in the audience braced themselves. They had seen Jasmine in action before: fiery debates, sharp comebacks, fearless confrontations with senior politicians. She had never hesitated to speak her truth. So naturally, everyone expected an explosion. Cameras zoomed in. Reporters prepared their pens. A producer from a major network whispered, "Here it comes." But Jasmine didn't move. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring at the judge. Her eyes didn't flinch. Her breathing was steady. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, then 10, long enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable. Then, slowly, she lifted her chin and gave the faintest hint of a smile. Not a smirk, not defiance. It was a look that said, "I hear you, but I'm not afraid of you." Judge Jones seemed to register it immediately. Her expression didn't change, but her fingers tapped the wooden bench once, a small, almost involuntary gesture. No one knew what would happen next. Was Jasmine about to speak? Would she apologize, hold her ground, or turn the courtroom upside down with one of her signature clapbacks? All those questions floated in the air like sparks waiting for ignition. The cameras caught every detail: the tension in Jasmine's jawline, the stern composure on Judge Jones's face, and the expectant eyes of the entire room watching the moment unfold in real time. Even the bailiff, usually expressionless, looked uneasy. Then, right before Jasmine opened her mouth, a low murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "She's not going to take that, is she?" Another voice replied, "This is about to go viral." But Jasmine didn't rush. She took her time, scanning the room, letting the moment breathe. You could tell she knew the weight of the situation. This wasn't just about one remark. It was about something much bigger. It was about a generational clash, a test of composure, a defining moment between old power and new voice. Finally, she took one quiet breath, the kind of breath you take before doing something unforgettable. And as the cameras rolled, Jasmine Crockett prepared to deliver a response that would not only shift the energy of that courtroom, but would soon light up screens across the country. Because what came next didn't just surprise the audience, it shocked even Judge Edith Jones herself.
To understand what made that courtroom moment so powerful, so electric, you need to know who these two women really are. Because what happened that day wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was a collision between two worlds. Judge Edith Holland Jones. To many inside the American legal system, her name commands instant respect and a little fear. For over 3 decades, she sat on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, one of the most influential courts in the country. Known as the Iron Lady of the Bench, Judge Jones built her legacy on discipline, intellect, and a belief in old-school order. She was the kind of judge who believed that respect wasn't requested, it was earned. She didn't raise her voice because she didn't have to. Her tone alone could silence an entire courtroom. Lawyers who appeared before her often described the experience as standing in front of a storm, quiet but powerful enough to blow you away if you weren't careful. She believed deeply in the traditions of law, hierarchy, and authority. To her, the courtroom was sacred ground, not a stage for politics, not a place for grandstanding. It was a temple of facts, discipline, and restraint. And that's exactly why the arrival of Jasmine Crockett, a woman from a completely different generation with a completely different energy, felt like a lightning bolt cutting through the clouds. Jasmine Crockett, born and raised in Dallas, Texas, a child of determination and grit. She grew up watching her parents work long hours, her mother a teacher, her father a mechanic. They taught her that respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned by standing up for what's right. Long before she became a congresswoman, Jasmine was a public defender, fighting for people who couldn't afford lawyers, standing up for those who didn't have a voice. She wasn't afraid to walk into a courtroom filled with doubt, bias, or criticism. Because for Jasmine, justice wasn't just a word, it was personal. Her career in politics came later, almost accidentally. People noticed her fearlessness, her ability to speak truth to power, and how she never let anyone intimidate her. Not judges, not politicians, not the media. She was blunt, fiery, but always backed by facts. Her style? Unfiltered honesty. Her philosophy? If something's wrong, say it out loud. And in a world where most leaders carefully script every sentence, Jasmine's authenticity made her stand out and made others uncomfortable. That day, the two women found themselves in the same room, a courtroom packed wall to wall with reporters, legal experts, and political analysts. It wasn't a trial. It was a special ethics hearing meant to address growing concerns about political influence in judicial decisions. Judge Edith Jones presided over the hearing as the senior authority. Jasmine Crockett had been called to give testimony, not as a defendant, not even as a witness to wrongdoing, but as a representative voice of Congress, speaking about transparency and reform. Everyone knew it was going to be a big day. CSN had cameras rolling. CNN, Fox, and MSNBC all had live feeds ready. Social media was already buzzing with hashtags like Crockett versus Jones and Courtroom Showdown before the hearing even started. When Jasmine entered the courtroom, she carried herself with confidence, not arrogance, but purpose. Her bright blue blazer stood out against the sea of dark suits, her curls perfectly styled, her notes neatly organized. She greeted the panel politely, smiled at the judge, and began her opening statement. Her words were clear and sharp. She spoke about the importance of accountability, how trust in the justice system was eroding, and how the people deserve transparency from those in power, judges included. It wasn't an attack, it was passion, but it was enough to make a few eyebrows rise across the room.
Judge Jones, who had spent her entire career maintaining order and neutrality, sat still, expression unreadable. But beneath the surface, you could sense a storm building. Every time Jasmine emphasized phrases like modern leadership, ethical responsibility, and speaking truth without fear, the judge's fingers tightened around her pen. To some in the audience, it looked like a generational confrontation unfolding in real time. One woman symbolizing tradition, structure, and the old guard, the other representing change, energy, and fearless new leadership. It wasn't disrespect, it was evolution. And evolution always makes the old guard uncomfortable. By the time Jasmine finished her statement, the room felt different, charged. Even those who disagreed with her couldn't deny the conviction in her voice. But that's when it happened. Judge Jones leaned forward, eyes sharp, tone steady as steel. And with decades of courtroom authority behind her, she delivered that line that would echo through the halls of the courthouse, across newsrooms, and onto millions of screens. Miss Crockett, your attitude in this hearing is precisely what's wrong with today's leaders. The air cracked like thunder. You could feel it, the old world and the new colliding right before your eyes. And what came next, no one in that courtroom was ready for.
For a full 5 seconds, Jasmine said absolutely nothing. But in that silence, something powerful was happening. The air in the courtroom felt heavy, like the moments before a storm breaks. Every heartbeat, every breath seemed to echo off the walls. Someone in the back shifted nervously. The faint sound of a pen tapping echoed like a drum beat in the stillness. Judge Edith Jones sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on Jasmine Crockett. Her face was calm, but her eyes were sharp, watching, waiting. Most people in that room thought Jasmine would explode like she had in those fiery debates that made headlines, but instead, she smiled. Not the sarcastic kind of smile that says, "I've got you cornered." No, it was subtle, calm, almost graceful, the kind of smile that said, "I know exactly who I am." Then Jasmine took a slow, steady breath and spoke, her voice low at first, but filled with quiet power. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she began, "if confidence looks like attitude to some, maybe it's time we redefine what leadership looks like." The words hung in the air. The courtroom gasped softly, not loud, but enough to feel the shift. Reporters glanced at each other, whispering, "Did she just say that to a judge?" Jasmine didn't stop. She raised her head slightly higher, her voice gaining strength as she spoke from somewhere deeper, not from pride, but from conviction. "I grew up in a time where women like me weren't expected to be in rooms like this," she said, her tone steady. "We were told to stay quiet, to be polite, to not question authority. But I'm here because silence doesn't change systems, courage does." Every word landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, shaking the air. Behind her, a young woman from the press pool quietly mouthed, "Wow." Even the courtroom guard, usually expressionless, blinked, slightly taken aback by the weight of Jasmine's calm defiance. Judge Jones's expression softened, just slightly. Her eyes narrowed, but not out of anger, out of thought, reflection. This wasn't the heated rebellion she had expected. This was measured truth, delivered with elegance. You could almost see the years of difference between them melt away for a moment. Two women who had walked very different paths meeting in one single defining confrontation. But Jasmine wasn't done. She leaned forward, not aggressively, but purposefully, the way a teacher might lean in when making a point that matters. "If standing up for fairness makes me look defiant," she said, pausing deliberately, "then I'll wear that attitude proudly." That final line hit like thunder. The room went completely still again. It wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration. A message not only to Judge Jones, but to everyone watching, in that room, on television, and eventually all across the internet.
A reporter sitting near the aisle scribbled furiously into her notepad. Another quietly whispered to his cameraman, "We just got our headline." For a long moment, Judge Jones said nothing. Her fingers, which had been resting neatly on the bench, tapped once, softly, rhythmically. Her gaze stayed locked on Jasmine. And then something unexpected happened. The judge leaned back in her chair, taking in the young congresswoman before her, not as an opponent, but a mirror of everything the next generation stood for. Maybe she saw a younger version of herself, fighting to be heard in rooms full of men who doubted her. Maybe she realized that what she called attitude was actually the courage that had once fueled her rise through the system. The audience could sense that shift, the unspoken moment of respect. Jasmine wasn't just a witness anymore. She had turned that courtroom into a stage for truth, and everyone, including the judge, was listening. And though Judge Jones still wore her signature composure, something in her eyes had changed. The tension wasn't anger anymore, it was understanding. Two women from different eras, different ideologies, and different battles had just met in the middle of history. Jasmine stood tall, not triumphant, but serene. Her voice softened as she added, almost gently, "Leadership isn't about who speaks the loudest, Your Honor. It's about who stands the firmest when it matters most." There it was, the closing note to her statement, calm and confident. The judge didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. She simply nodded once, almost imperceptibly, the kind of nod that said, "Point taken." The courtroom, still suspended in silence, began to breathe again. A low murmur spread across the audience. Reporters started typing furiously. Cameras zoomed in to capture Jasmine's face, steady, composed, unshaken. No one knew it yet, but that single exchange, that clash of eras, would soon go viral. Clips would flood social media within hours. Headlines would read, "Judge challenges Jasmine Crockett, but her response changes everything." And for many watching around the world, this wasn't just courtroom drama. It was a glimpse of something bigger. A moment where the old world and the new collided, and somehow both walked away changed.
For a moment, no one dared to breathe. Then, almost as if the air itself shifted, the courtroom erupted. Not in noise, but in energy. It was like the entire room exhaled at once. A rush of emotion, of disbelief, of awe swept across the faces of everyone there. Even the reporters, the ones who usually live for drama, froze mid-sentence, their fingers hovering above their keyboards. No one wanted to break the silence that followed Jasmine Crockett's words. In the front row, a young intern for one of the networks whispered under her breath, "Did that really just happen?" The court clerks, who had spent years watching dry testimonies and rehearsed speeches, exchanged quiet glances that said everything. This was different. And near the back, one of the younger attorneys, barely out of law school, mouthed a single word to her colleague. Wow. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried the exact emotion that everyone else in that courtroom felt. For the first time in years, Judge Edith Jones didn't respond right away. No immediate rebuttal, no stern lecture, just silence. She leaned back slowly in her chair, her robe rustling softly as she folded her hands in front of her. Her face was unreadable, a perfect mask of composure, but behind those sharp eyes, something was happening. The cameras caught it. The room felt it. This was not the look of a judge preparing to scold or dismiss. This was the look of a woman, one who had spent her entire life commanding authority, now faced with a truth she hadn't expected to hear and couldn't ignore. Seconds ticked by. 5, 10, 15. The silence was deafening. And then it happened. The faintest, most unexpected thing broke through the tension. Judge Edith Jones smiled. It wasn't forced. It wasn't mocking. It was genuine, small, but enough to make the entire courtroom feel lighter in an instant. People blinked, stunned. A few reporters even looked at each other whispering, "Did she just smile?" And then, in that same calm, deliberate tone that have commanded decades of courtrooms, Judge Jones spoke. "Miss Crockett," she said slowly, choosing each word with precision, "I may not agree with your style, but I respect your conviction." There was a pause, the kind that feels like a full minute. And this courtroom, she continued, could use more of that honesty. It was a simple statement, but the effect was earth-shattering. You could almost hear the tension cracking like glass shattering on marble floors. People let out the breaths they'd been holding for the last several minutes. The bailiff, who had been standing stiff as a statue, relaxed his shoulders. One of the reporters actually smiled. And Jasmine? She just nodded softly, not with arrogance, but with quiet gratitude. Because she knew that sentence from Judge Jones wasn't just approval, it was respect. In that moment, something profound happened, something rare in politics, rarer still in courtrooms. Two powerful women from different eras, different worlds, and vastly different beliefs had just met in the middle of truth. It wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about understanding. Judge Jones had seen something in Jasmine, the courage, the conviction, the fire, that maybe reminded her of her younger self. And Jasmine, in turn, had seen something in Judge Jones, the strength, the wisdom, the discipline that she too respected deeply. That single moment of mutual recognition cut through generations, ideologies, and expectations. For the first time in that courtroom, there was no left or right, no hierarchy. Just two women, two leaders who understood that truth can sound different depending on who speaks it, but it means the same thing when spoken with integrity. As the tension faded, the room began to hum again with whispers. Reporters started typing rapidly, capturing the exact quote that would soon flood headlines across the nation. Judge Edith Jones tells Jasmine Crockett, "I respect your conviction." The phrase echoed on every network, on every social media platform, within hours. Clips of Jasmine's speech and the judge's response were replayed millions of times, analyzed, quoted, and turned into countless think pieces. But what people loved most wasn't the confrontation. It was the ending. Because in a world where disagreements often turn toxic, here was a rare moment of grace. Two women didn't shout over each other. They listened, they learned, and in doing so, they showed everyone watching that respect doesn't require agreement. It requires understanding. As Jasmine Crockett gathered her papers and prepared to leave, she caught Judge Jones's eye one more time. The judge gave a slight nod, not as a superior, but as an equal. And Jasmine returned it, smiling gently before turning away. No mic drop, no victory pose, just mutual respect. The kind of quiet power that doesn't need to be loud to be unforgettable. And that's how, on that day and that courtroom, what started as a clash became something far greater. A reminder that even in the toughest rooms, truth still has the power to connect hearts, bridge divides, and rewrite history.
The moment the gavel came down, it wasn't just the end of a courtroom session. It was the start of something much bigger. Outside those tall marble doors, history was already being written. What had just unfolded inside wasn't simply a hearing. It was a defining exchange between two powerful women, a moment that captured the attention and the hearts of an entire nation. Within hours, clips of Jasmine Crockett's calm yet powerful response began spreading like wildfire across social media. The way she stood her ground, unshaken, composed, yet fiercely confident, struck a nerve. And when Judge Edith Jones, a figure of authority and tradition, chose to respond not with dismissal but with respect, something shifted. It wasn't just a viral moment. It was a mirror reflecting where America stood and where it could go. The headline flashed everywhere. Judge confronts Jasmine Crockett, but it's her response that wins the internet. The clip that shook the internet. The clip was less than 2 minutes long, but it carried the weight of a cultural shift. Political pages posted it. Commentators broke it down frame by frame. Even comedians and talk show hosts couldn't help but mention it. People weren't just watching it, they were feeling it. Replay after replay, viewers found new meaning in the way Jasmine's tone never wavered, how Judge Jones's expression softened mid-exchange, and how, for a split second, time itself seemed to pause. Across platforms, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, the clip gathered millions of views. On late-night television, hosts called it the moment dignity went viral. Comment sections turned into living discussions, buzzing with emotion. Some people praised Jasmine's courage, writing, "She didn't raise her voice, but she raised the standard." Others applauded Judge Jones for her humility. That smile from Judge Jones said more than 100 verdicts ever could. It was one of those rare times when both sides, liberal and conservative, young and old, activist and traditionalist, found something they could actually agree on. For a few brief hours, America wasn't divided. It was inspired. See a lesson in respect. Analysts on morning shows described it as a masterclass in dignity. Teachers showed it in classrooms as an example of composure under pressure. Law students debated it in ethics seminars. It wasn't about who won the exchange, it was about how it happened. No shouting, no chaos, just truth spoken plainly and received with grace. Viewers said it felt like watching two generations finally meet eye to eye, one representing experience, the other representing progress. As one user commented, "Judge Jones showed that authority doesn't mean arrogance. Jasmine proved that confidence doesn't mean disrespect. That's how real conversation should look." Overseas, the ripple effect. By the next morning, the story had reached beyond U.S. borders. News outlets in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East shared the clip, calling it a rare example of mutual respect in politics. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to discussing the exchange. Social media hashtags like Crockett Moment, Respect and Truth, and Leadership Redefined dominated timelines. Even celebrities began reposting the quote that had captured hearts everywhere. If confidence looks like attitude, maybe it's time we redefined leadership. Motivational speakers used it in their keynotes. Students wrote essays about it. It wasn't just a courtroom scene anymore. It had become a movement, shedding a light on hearts everywhere. In a time when outrage spreads faster than understanding, this short exchange reminded people that power doesn't have to roar. Sometimes it speaks softly, with clarity and conviction. Jasmine's composure became a symbol of a new kind of leadership, one rooted in truth, respect, and emotional intelligence. And Judge Jones's willingness to acknowledge that courage became a lesson in humility for those who had forgotten what respect across differences looks like. That's why this moment stayed alive far longer than anyone expected. It transcended politics. It transcended generations. It reminded everyone, from college students to courtroom veterans, that the strength of a nation isn't measured by how loud its leaders speak, but by how deeply they listen. As one viral comment summed it up perfectly, that wasn't a debate. It was a turning point, a reminder that when grace meets truth, everyone wins. And so, as the digital world continued to replay that exchange over and over again, one thing became clear. What happened inside that courtroom didn't end with the gavel. It marked the beginning of a new conversation about courage, humility, and what leadership should truly look like in the modern world.